Good afternoon and welcome to the Power of Three campaign, Mobilizing Social Work's Vision and Voice Through Voting, presented by NASW. We hope you enjoy the program and we thank you for joining us today. At this time, I will turn the program over to you, Angelo. Please begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar entitled The Power of Three campaign, Mobilizing Social Work's Vision and Voice Through Voting. I'm excited to be with you here today, and hopefully you are as well. I want to thank everyone who's participating in this webinar, because your participation is an indication that you want to be part of the movement, the social work movement, to mobilize our clients and our communities to make sure that they take full advantage of their right to lift up their voice and vote. I want to give a shout out before we start to Mimi Abramowitz and Terry Miserati. You guys have been champions in social work's voting, advocacy, and mobilization movement, and thank you for doing that work. This is not work that's new to you. You've been, I know we were doing the 2016 campaign, the 2020 campaign, the 2018 campaign, and now the 2022 campaign, really saying we want to make sure that social workers are helping our clients and our communities exercise their power through their vote. And it's interesting when you think about today's title, Vision, Voice, and Voting. And we know that it's important that people exercise the right to vote, because it's really one of the most basic rights we have in a democracy. Today, you're going to hear about understanding the history of voting in the United States. And a lot of that history is about denying people the right to vote, denying people their right to lift up their voices through all kinds of I was going to say creative, they're not necessarily creative, but through all kinds of means. How many jelly beans are in a jar? If you can guess the right number of jelly beans in a jar, you might get the vote. I could go on and on. But you'll also hear about the benefits of voting, and you'll be able to identify how those benefits translate into at the community level. When we talk about voting rights, voter suppression, we have to be aware of the myths and the misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and that misinformation is intentional. And so we have to be wise and really be able to look through those myths and that misinformation, and be able to counter the barriers, the myths, and misinformation that are specifically intended to limit voter participation. As social workers, we have a duty to acquire the information, the skills, and the resources needed to mobilize eligible voters to register and cast their ballot successfully. That sounds like something simple to do, but it takes a lot of work, because there's a lot of barriers that out there that would discourage people from voting. But we can play a role in helping empower our clients and our communities. And we think about empowerment, and you think just about how powerful it is to participate in the governance of our nation. By casting a vote, the clients and communities we care about are participating in the governance of our nation and exercising their power. We know everything that's going on around us. We said this 8 years ago, 4 years ago, 2 years ago, that voting is more important today than it has ever been before. And that is true given the times we're living in. Now, for me, on a personal note, when I think about voting, when I think about the times that my ancestors were counted as 3/5 of a person, 3/5 of a person, not a whole person, 3/5 of a person. So it's really personal to me that one person equals one vote. We know historically there have been patterns of success, struggles, backlash, and that backlash and those struggles are aimed at making those who are perceived to be powerless suffer the loss of our vote and thereby silencing our voices. It's up to us as social workers and to our colleagues who love democracy and who love freedom to make this a moment of progress. We don't want to see this as a moment where the backlash is successful. We don't want to see this as a moment where the struggles discourage folks from exercising their right to vote. We want to see this as a moment of progress. And by coming together, we can make this a moment of progress. As social workers, we've got a duty to be there for our clients and communities and make sure that they're exercising the power that they have to cast their vote and participate in our democracy. With that, those are my sort of closing opening remarks. I will tell you at NASW, we are, I don't know if it's knee deep, ankle deep, up to here deep, but our leadership through Dr. Mitt Joyner, we've got a passionate presence in the movement, the social work movement, and advocacy and voter mobilization. And we'll do more of these events in the coming months ahead. With that, I will introduce Mimi Abramowitz from the Silverman School of Social Work, and she'll get us going. Over to you, Mimi.
Thank you. And I'd like to start by thanking NASW for hosting the second in our Power of Three webinar series. You've been a strong and powerful endorser of this campaign, and we appreciate all that you've done, including this webinar. On a personal note, I just want to say how I got involved in this. I was active in the civil rights movement quite a while ago, and I was thrilled when voting rights were won and held up. Then voter suppression started to show its ugly face. And my friend and colleague, Terry Mizrahi, said, "Hey, Mimi, do you want to launch a national social work voter mobilization campaign?" And I shouted, "Yes." And as you said, we've been doing this since 2016. And along the way, I became not only upset about voter suppression, but also about the threats to democracy. And I'm going to focus on that in particular in my opening comments. Next. So it's been said before, earlier today, voting is more important than ever before. Next. Why? Well, there are some benefits of voting. First of all, it benefits individuals, communities, and the profession. For individuals who vote, we get higher levels of health and mental health, stronger social connections, better employment outcomes, and a greater sense of individual efficacy. Communities with higher voter turnout receive more attention, quicker responses, and greater resources from legislators than communities with low voter turnout. And for the profession as well, voting elevates social work's visibility and voice. It supports programs and services that benefit our clients, our communities, and wider society. And all this is backed up by research. Next. While voting is the most basic right in our democracy, we need to protect democracy. And it was not easy to get here. Next. Social movements played a key role in securing democracy and voting rights. History tells us that since 1900, the victories of the suffrage, labor, and civil rights movements increased access to the ballot for women, workers, and persons of colors. And you'll see there a picture of the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, and Lyndon Baines Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act with Martin Luther King in front of him. But each time, the expansion of voting rights threatened white supremacy, male domination, and class power. Those are big words, but you know what I mean. And because of this, the voting rights immediately came under attack. Next. So here's a very quick history lesson. Historians will kill me, but I'm going to do this really hop, skip, and jump. As Angelo said, it's been periods of struggle, progress, and backlash. So what this slide shows is that the struggles and progress on one side, the threat, and then the response. So, and these are landmark moments. So after the Civil War ended, it was followed by the period of Reconstruction, when we guaranteed Black men the right to vote, participate in the political process, acquire land, and hold elected office. The next milestone was the Civil Rights Movement. This led Congress to enact laws about to desegregate society and to enforce voting rights laws. And then, a while after that, we elected the first Black president, and we saw the rise of the voting rights movement. Each one of these struggle and progress led to a threat. Each one of them challenged white supremacy. So the response was, in all cases, to restore white supremacy. So in the early period, it was racial violence, Black massacres, some of you may have heard of Tulsa, lynching, and ongoing police brutality. But even that early period, as you can see, post-Reconstruction, we started to see voter suppression. You heard about the jelly beans in the jar. Those were like poll taxes and literacy tests. There was also fellow disenfranchisement and voter intimidation. You see, these are not new. And then in the civil rights era, some of those earlier tactics, well, I say we weren't withdrawn, but they died down. But we continued to have weak enforcement of voting rights laws, manipulation of the political process through the filibuster and gerrymandering. And today, and since the mid-70s, the current attack on voting rights has started again. The Supreme Court ended the pre-clearance requirements that we got secured in the late 60s for states who had bad voting rights records. The voter suppression laws were revived, and there were new efforts to overturn election results. And I'm going to talk about those next in a little more detail. Next. So the right to vote is still under attack today. The current version of the past, driven mostly by threats to white supremacy, include voter suppression, intentionally designed to demoralize the electorate. Since January 22, more than half the states have introduced more than 250 bills to suppress the vote, up from 75 bills in 24 states in 2021. They are not fooling around. Election subversion, that word is not so familiar, but what it is the process of interfering with the administration of elections and overriding the will of the voters. As of March 2022, more than 13 states introduced 41 bills to subvert, overturn, or undermine elections in these ways. They are not fooling around. Gerrymandering you're more familiar with, redrawing maps of election districts to systematically disenfranchise Black and Latino voters. Next. And then, of course, there was the attempted coup. On January 6th, we witnessed this coup. An insurrectionist mob falsely claimed that the election was stolen. This mob stormed the Capitol to stop Congress from counting the Electoral College votes. Next. What was the impact of all these attacks? Basically, fewer persons of color got to vote. In 2020, we had record voter turnout, the largest in 120 years. Yet, 75% of white persons, but only 58% of persons of color voted. This racial gap will worsen with the new restrictive voting laws. Next. And we were warned. In a book called How Democracies Die, 2 political scientists identified 4 warning signs of democracies in trouble. These signs include rejecting democratic norms or the rules of the game, denying legitimacy of political opponents, curtailing opponents' civil liberties, including the media, and tolerating or encouraging violence. You probably know that nearly all of these signs are evident in the United States today. Democracy is in danger. And the authors conclude that democracy does not necessarily end with a bang, a violent military revolution, or by a coup. Rather, it ends with a slow, steady weakening of critical institutions, the vote, elections, the press, the courts, and the media. Next. Even President Biden has declared the long-standing guardrails of U.S. democracy have been shaken. They have placed a dagger at the heart of democracy. Next. And it's not just a vote. Democracy is also under attack on other fronts. You probably have heard about the rise of banning books. It's unbelievable that we are banning books in the United States of America. 39 states have introduced more than 150 bills to ban books on any topic that makes students uncomfortable. And of course, they focus on critical race theory and gay rights. Our press is becoming less independent. The number of daily papers are down by 28%. The number of investigative journalists is down by 50%. Meanwhile, large media corporations own 80%, I said 80% of all daily newspapers. I don't think we realize that when we're flipping those pages. Those of you who still read paper copies of the newspaper. And there's less trust in government. In 1960, 3/4 of Americans trusted the federal government most of the time. Today, it's less than 25%, an all-time low. Next. Democracy is increasingly at risk in the United States, but also abroad. The US has been described by a democracy and/or is sitting between democracy and authoritarianism by established organizations that do such rankings, such as the Economist, which produces a democracy index. And over the last 10 years, the number of democratic countries fell from 42 to 34, representing only 13% of the world's population. And keep your eye on the upcoming runoff in France between the current prime minister and a person representing the far right. Next. What can social workers do? Well, we are good at diagnosing individual and social problems. Yet we, along with many Americans, are not always ready or comfortable with assessing the status of our democratic institutions. We have to up our game. Next. We can and must up our game to help strengthen our democratic institutions. Why? Well, for one, it's the right thing to do. It supports the profession's mission and social justice values. And we are in the right place. I always say we sit at the intersection between the individual and society, whether at a desk in an office or in a community meeting. And therefore, we are best positioned to witness and address the harms brought by a faltering democracy, and to bring civic participation into the classroom, voter registration into the field, and human rights into the United States. Next. Be part of history. Join the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign. Next. You can speak out. Your voice is your vote. Your vote is your voice. Be heard. Next. Be part of the solution. Imagine if all 700,000 social workers in the United States each registered 3 people to vote, and they registered 3 more, and so on. No need to imagine. Join our Power of 3 voter registration campaign. Don't mourn, organize. Take the Power of 3 pledge. Register 3 people to vote. And for more exciting information and resources, you can check out the 2 websites linked there. But you don't have to wait till you get a chance to check out Terry Mizrahi is going to tell you more about the Power of 3 campaign. Thank you.
Hello, happy to follow Mimi and tell you, as she said, in more detail. And I think what we're going to see is going from those general words of wisdom from Angelo, the head of NASW, and Mimi's history, my focusing on social work and what we can do. And then we're going to be hearing from our colleagues in the field who are actually doing some of the things that we're talking about. And as Mimi said, and I'll only introduce, I am Professor Emeritus from Silverman, and working very hard with other people to increase the macro presence in social work, to balance macro and micro, so that we have we can do that individual and society that Mimi mentioned. And I do want to start to say next that our campaign, the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, we now call voting as social work. So you may see, for those of you who are new and listening the first time, BISW, you may see those initials a lot. And for those of you who have a refresher, you'll see a new and improved website that we'll look at in a few minutes. Just to say something, that our campaign is nonpartisan. We are not, and formally and officially and with all intent, not to support particular candidates or parties, and therefore everything else we're doing is legal and ethical and promoted by our Code of Ethics, our Council on Social Work Education, and so on. So just a very brief history of where social work is and has been. So in 1985, there was something called the Human Serve Campaign, which asked social work agencies to register clients and constituents. It had some success. We had not as much as we could and should have. Fast forward to the President Clinton's era, and two of our colleagues, among many, of course, led and promoted the National Voter Registration Act. We all call it, and many of you have heard it, as Voter Mobilization, Voter Motor Act. Now, Voter Motor does not mean that just registering people in the public agency of your DMV, which you should be, but they actually encourage and promote, and some require any public agency that works with clients or communities or constituents to register to vote, have the forms there in hard copy, or now more and more online. And there are websites, as you can see, to get more information. Next. So there's the picture of our two colleagues with President Clinton. I don't remember who the two people are on either side of Frances Fox Piven. She's on the left, and the gentleman in glasses is a well-known person to many of us, I think, on this call. We've read his wonderful material over the years, Cloward and Piven, and that's Richard Cloward. Next. So the importance of why. Again, you'll hear some repetition for emphasis, for reinforcement from what Angelo said, what Mimi said, and now just a couple of extra reinforcements about the social determinants of health, that individuals, communities who vote are better off. This whole notion of voting being a human right, and to deal with all those systemic barriers that Mimi talked about. And then, as Angela mentioned, empowerment practice. Anybody who's on this call who's a social worker has heard that term and hopefully is practicing a version of that, whether you're in at the micro or macro level. And voting is an act of power, individual and collective. And I want to say that it's registering that's the act of empowerment. People then can decide who they vote for, and sometimes even if they go to the polls. But if they're not registered, then it's not possible. And you can't imagine, any of us here probably have had that experience on election day. People are running around, and except for the 13 states, I believe, that you can vote on, register on election day, it's too late. So this is all gearing up between now and November of this year that we're focusing. And as you know, John Lewis has said that the vote is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have. Next. And the problem, again, just to reinforce a few things quickly, and thanks to my colleagues, both Mimi and Tanya Smith from the UConn School of Social Work, Humphreys Institute, for some of these slides and putting them together, that there are still 80 million eligible voters unregistered as of 2020. And what does that represent? 24%. Angelo, I hope I'm not going to be wrong in recoding you. We always do that on any given day. Social workers work with about 12 million clients, and that probably half of them don't vote or are not registered to vote. And those are most likely to be the folks that we serve and are in the most in need. Next. And this is what is so important. I can't emphasize this enough as Sabrina and Samantha and Carissa and Simone start to talk about their real lifetimes in the field, that there's something called the Hatch Act, that it is legal in every state to register and promote voting activities in your agency as well as in your community and any of your civic organizations, with those two exceptions that I've repeated, without supporting a particular candidate and specific party. So please, if those myths that I think Angelo started saying, these myths live on in disinformation, because that's deliberately distorting the facts. Public agencies, as I said, in many cases, they're required, for example, with the VA. And the evidence of voter fraud. Right now, of course, we know that it's said all the time, it's been repeated by our former president, as you know. I can't imagine anybody who doesn't know that the 2020 election was a fraud. And if somebody says that to you quietly as a professional, show me, where do you have the evidence? Where does it say that? I haven't seen it. We just have to dispel the myths in any way we can. Next. So our campaign goals are pretty simple. The voting social work campaign, mobilize our clientele. And by clients, we mean clients, constituents, colleagues, and in the community at all levels. And what we'll see in a few minutes when I show you the website is that there is specific material, tools and techniques and resources. There is nothing that I hope that you need that you wouldn't find on our website by clicking onto certain tabs, as you'll see in a minute. But we have to go further, and I'm saying that after Mimi's talk about where we are today. To ensure that people get to the polls and cast their votes is going to be more difficult than ever. And so I want to end that part by saying, whatever it takes, social workers, whatever it takes to get your clients who might have been kicked off the rolls, or the poll places changed, or somebody is standing with a uniform in front of their polling place, that they have that absolute right to be there and to be a poll watcher, to be at the polls, is some now very important activity that social workers have done in the past and hopefully will do it. So, and we want to engage us in the long term in getting it into social work education, so that when you're in the field, I'm asking everybody who's on this call today that to go back to your agency if you're working, and make sure that in the intake form, there is a question, are you registered to vote if you're eligible? And many of them have added it, but still there's too many that don't. If it's on the intake form, then it's not just up to the individual social worker to do the job. Next. And you can make a difference. And I want to now, in a minute, to go to look at our website. And as you could see, there are several ways that you could do. And I hope that everybody, when you leave today, will tell us or pledge to participate in one thing. Do one thing that you haven't done, including those registering 3 folks. And they could be your mother, your uncle, your neighbor, the grocer, asking the question, I think we've heard several times in that the studies say the major reason, or one of the major reasons that people don't vote, is that they have never been asked. They have never been asked. It sounds a little strange perhaps to some of us, but if you haven't been asked, you may not know to go ahead. And of course, how to do it now, as you see there, we have a QR code. It couldn't be simpler for folks who use that now. You click on it, and we are working with something called Turbo Vote that will give people messages and information about where to register and how to make that possible. And let's make it part of your classroom. If you're a field instructor on this call, if you're a student, please raise it in all those venues. Next. And Mimi, we have a similar slide for that emphasis that your vote is your voice and voting is social work. So thank you. And let's go to the to our website for 1 minute. This, if you put in voting is social work or the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, this will come up. And what you'll see, this is our homepage. And if you scroll down, we're just going to do this a very quick tour. If these are in these little squares, you see you see several important places for resources. But if we just click on going back up to the Power of Three for a moment, take the Power of Three pledge, just go to the website, click on it, and just go down. We won't click on these. We'll show you what's there. More information about the campaign, as Mimi started to say, and we're constantly talking about. And there's the QR code that you can register people or yourself, or check your registration as a way to do it. And then all the tools we have to get started. If we could just go, we have here, we have a flyer, we have a palm card that people could print out, and you can do everything online. And there's a wonderful journal article by our colleague Tanya Smith and others about their positive experience with the power of social work. So last thing, I just wanted to just go back up to those tabs for a minute on the homepage, just to show you one other thing. If we up to the top, if you click on, let me just see, where are we? Slightly more up to the, yeah. So where it says to join us, just click on that and you'll see join us. There's a pledge to participate. There's a way to sign up or sign in with us. And again, you put your name in, you'll give it to us, and you can take, if one thing we ask you to do, of course, if you want to do more, there's one for the individual and one that you could share with your colleagues and your supervisors and your community organizations. You don't have to be a social worker to participate in this campaign and use our resources, of course. So thank you very much. And we're going to move on to hear the folks who are doing the work. You can be part of the solution. And here we have, we're going to be talking with Carissa and Simone. Take it away.
Thank you so much. All right, so a bit about me, although my bio is indicated on the slide. My name is Carissa Proctor. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm from Allentown, Pennsylvania. I got my BSW at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania. I also got minors in psychology and case management. Currently now, I'm a community administration and policy practice student at Howard University. I have a specialization in displaced populations, and I'm very excited to graduate on May 7th. Thank you so much. I'm also currently a John E. and Barbara S. Jacobs Social Justice Fellow with Simone. I'm also interning where I am right now at the National Association of Social Workers headquarters under Social Work Pioneer and President Joyner, who we will also hear from today. In this role, I've been a producer for the Essential Chats with Mitt, and I have also recently just wrapped up as the chair of the IFSW North American Region 2022 International Conference, which uplifted Indigenous communities. Next slide. So a little bit about why I got into this work. My mom, who's on my slide, she was and still is, for as long as I can remember, a voting rights clerk. So she volunteers and helps people out when we are waiting in line for long times, if you're like me. She has also helped me to understand where I came from and why it's important to vote. So a quote from Deborah Gray White reads, while the celebration of the 19th Amendment, we also should celebrate the 1965 Voting Rights Act that made the amendment a reality for millions of Black women. This was a great accomplishment, but it did not stop the barriers that my community has faced. Restricting, gerrymandering, intimidation, and voter suppression are also barriers that many people of color face today. Crystal Mason, by the way, has been sentenced to 5 years, not realizing that she did not have the right to vote. Going back to the insurrection, I think that she may have gotten in more trouble than everyone else combined. Additionally, Black folks face harsher sentences than their white counterparts who have not committed the same offenses, and this can cause them to lose the right to vote. And because of these factors, I knew that I wanted to make a change. Being an intern at NASW has given me the opportunity to do that. So President Mitt Joyner, as I call her Professor Joyner, for her presidency, she has focused on how the social work profession might protect the right to vote. That way that I've been able to be a part of that specific change has been through education, which I really, really value. I was able to actually create a voting rights fact sheet, which is on the NASW website. If you look up my name, I'm sure you can find it. It highlighted how African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic Americans have faced unjust laws and are currently facing voter suppression. Dr. McLean actually mentioned how there are a lot of myths surrounding voting, and that's how I've been able to combat that. I've also been able to aid in adjusting some of the PowerPoints that have been used for NASW, and that has been able to highlight the highlight of my voting advocacy has been able to take over Professor Joyner's place on the February Essential Chat with Mitt. This was called The Voices and Concerns of Young Black and Brown Voters. On this platform, we were able to tell our real stories, and we were able to talk about the hard truths about what it is to be a young social work voter, as well as a young social worker. And that was just a really pivotal conversation for me, as well as Simone, I'm sure, because we got to really use our voices and uplift other people in our communities. Next slide. So why social work? Technically, anyone can engage in social justice work, of course. And while that's true, not everyone knows the proper skills. Much like a lot of people, I wasn't really sure of what I wanted to do in undergrad. I took an intro to social work course on the first day. Our professor actually made us take a biases test, and it was like huge. It was a very long list of all the potential people you could possibly work with. And when I looked at that, I was like, oh yeah, this is definitely what I want to do, because there's just so many opportunities. There's so many people that you could possibly work with, reach out to. And a shared belief that the Voting and Social Work campaign and I have is that social work being a core principle sticks out because it means that we can participate in the decisions for all people. Social workers could and should be in the place where all decisions are made because we are leaders, we are change agents, and it is important to note that social workers can't limit themselves to the title of just social work. You know, we have an endless amount of skills, and we should be able to apply that in any places where decisions are being made, where changes are being made. Social workers, you know, we're able to take the person and environment perspective and we can apply that to make sure that this environment that we're all in is safe for all people. Social workers can also be community organizers and managers, and we can also run for office, speaking of voting. Next slide. So what have I specifically done? I put this slide together to showcase that there is more than one way to be an advocate. So like I stated before, I advocate through education. I put the fact sheets together, I helped create PowerPoints, and I went on many educational chats, which you can find also on the YouTube page for NASW. But I also made sure that I was engaging in digital advocacy by myself. So I think that, you know, for a lot of young people, we're always on social media. And that could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing, but it's a good thing when we're using it for advocacy and we're using it to help our voices be out there. Specifically for digital advocacy, Instagram is a great tool. Twitter is a great tool if, you know, you're saying appropriate things, as well as Facebook. It's actually super easy in today's day and age to go viral. And imagine if we were going viral through spreading social work messages, if we were spreading social work values and about the importance of voting. I also found that through my past sorority, Venmo boards are actually a huge way to make a difference. So Venmo boards, if you aren't familiar, you can take an Instagram highlight and you can put dollar signs on it. And then someone who specifically donates to your cause through Venmo, they would get their name up there. And, you know, a lot of the time people care for notoriety. People want to be recognized that they did something great, that they helped someone out. And I have found that people have been able to raise thousands of dollars in only an hour through Venmo boards, because they were able to get their face out there, they would get their name out there, they could post it on their site and say, hey, look at this, I did this. It's a really great tool, and not a lot of people know about it because it is such a new platform. But I always like to ensure that people know that there is a million different ways that you can raise money, you can help, you can spread your messages through social media. Specifically with grassroots organizing, I have done that as well. I like to call this doing the work, even though, of course, spreading education and digital advocacy is doing the work as well. But I think getting out there and going on the street and advocating for people's needs is super important. You know, when we hold those signs up there, people read them, people see them. If you're talking and you're building rapport with people who are on the street, you're in such a good position to make a difference. I love to make signs. Although I maybe am not the best artist in the world, I definitely can fixate glitter glue these days. But I also think that this type of organizing could be educational panels, it could be protests, it could be walkathons. I've actually helped to organize with the American Suicide Foundation. We call them Out of the Darkness walks, where we have been able to organize thousands of dollars for suicide awareness and suicide assistance for specific people. I did that in my undergrad, and without saying any names, of course, we were able to help about 5 young women and girls to alleviate their suffering, which was huge at the time. So how does this all specifically relate to voting? Advocating for equal rights and working to advance people's rights is voter advocacy. Many people cannot vote because they don't have equal rights across the board. And advocating for people to have better access to polls is a huge way that we can start and get there. We can also, of course, start with the Power of 3 campaign. So when you register someone, ask them if they are aware of their rights. Ask them if they know where their polling place is. Ask them if they have adequate transportation to get to the polls. Building that rapport for someone can also inspire them to do the same. So they're saying, oh, I saw this person. She helped me. Maybe I can help someone as well. It also creates a huge ripple effect when you smile at somebody, you know, when you ask them how their day is. And when you do that, they're way more likely to listen to the specific message that you have. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today. I'm really excited to hear from my fellow, as I call her, Simone.
Hi, everyone. Gratitude for this space and for the learning opportunity. As Caressa mentioned, we are both scholars at Howard and have the privilege of learning as well under Professor Joyner. I won't read everything that's on the screen here, but I really just wanted to name who I am. So I know that we are here as social workers, but we're also people, right? And as people, our identities, whether we are mothers, caregivers, younger sisters, aunties, cousins, kinfolk, all of these identities, right? All of these are also reasons that we vote. And so I wanted to start with this to say, yes, I'm Simone. My pronouns are she, her, hers. For anyone who may need a visual description, I am a dark-skinned Black woman. I have locks that are almost down to my chin, and I'm wearing glasses. Because again, if we think about the people who we vote for, the people who we are, we also want to make sure that we are being accessible to social workers that have disabilities, but also to people in our community who have disabilities as well. And so what you'll see in my bio is in part of what informs my social work practice or my interest in social work has really been community organizing. Next slide, please. So why social work? And now I feel like I just gave it away on the last slide, but I'm gonna repeat it again, and that's all good, right? Is that I come to social work as a mother and organizer. That was my core. Essentially, I was working in community for close to like 9-10 years, and I was so worried that what we were doing was not gonna be sustainable because so many of us were getting burnt out. I know earlier in the presentation, right, we talked about how so much progress, right, has been met with conflict and confrontation and attempts to take back these rights that we have so righteously earned, right? And so in my work as organizing, I really had to pause after a lot of loving work to say, well, how are we going to continue doing this? And that's when I found the work of Cara Page, and I do want to name that they are a Black and Indigenous person with a disability who created something called Healing Justice as a framework. And something that they shared was that our movements themselves have to be healing or there's no point to them. No, I could say a million different reasons why this applies to social work. But I think as we started in the beginning, we talked about social workers not only can operate to diagnose people, but should be operating right to diagnose systems. And this really gets to what this quote is saying. We don't want to glamorize burnout. We don't want to glamorize moving past our bodies. But we do want to actively remind ourselves of who we're doing this work for and the communities that we want to create. So what I put on this slide are actually pictures of why I do this work, how I got to social work. And so one was actually doing community organizing within the school. So I was a group of Black activists who created curriculum for the first Black Talking in Class in the Central Coast of California, where we met with Black high schoolers and they wrote social action plans for their schools and presented them to the school board and principals. Because again, voting is not just for president and vice president, it's also for school board members, right, who influence what our young people are learning and how they engage and create critical questions. The other image I have on the screen is of a long effort. It's taken 6 years now to actually get independent oversight of our police department. And so some of you may know, sheriff, we vote for sheriff. So again, voting, all of these different ways that our lives are impacted. So why social work? Why voting? It was really just to affirm my value as a person, the communities that I needed to thrive in, and reminding myself of the people who matter to me, right? Next slide, please. So why vote? I made sure to include my Babu on here, my grandfather who has now passed away, but his story is very much my story. So the image at the bottom of the screen is actually from Tent City in Tennessee. And this was important to my family because my Babu, who grew up as a sharecropper in Summersville, Tennessee, was seeing people come to his community, talk about voting, but also living and seeing daily the violence of white supremacy, right? And so with courage, especially when a person in their community was accused of a crime, there were organizers who came to their area and encouraged people to sign up and register to vote. Because something we don't talk about a lot is that also voter registration is one of these pools of information that's used to actually fill juries, right? And so we had Black folks in Tennessee who were sharecroppers, who were courageous enough to register to vote, who then were displaced from the places they knew as home, from white owners who refused to allow them their full rights. And so my grandfather's family and those he loved actually lived in this space called Tent City, as they were incredibly, incredibly sure of their rights as people. And if I think about what it meant for my Babu to share these stories with me, and then realize what it meant for him to work as decades as a poll worker, greeting people at all of the places he moved, maybe not telling them the full story because my grandfather can talk, but talking about the importance, right, of Black folks showing up for themselves and their communities. So at my core, I vote because I am Babu's grandchild and because I have inherited a legacy of knowing and engaging with my rights. Next slide, please. So what does this look like? I mentioned before, y'all, that I'm incredibly invested in community organizing. And so I'm super proud to be one of the co-founders of Healing Justice Santa Barbara. I would encourage you to follow and support our work. But we have shown up in many, many different ways. So we started by actually hosting Black voter panels. So we just had Black folks that we cared about, including Black teens who maybe weren't able to vote yet, but did have opinions and were impacted by school boards, to asking Black parents, Black folks with disabilities, Black folks who were LGBTQIA+, Black social workers, to come together and actually talk about what do we want for our communities. We then were like, this isn't getting to everybody, because we were still seeing some folks who were like, voting isn't for me, this doesn't match my needs or desires. And so then we decided to really lean into art as activism, because we know sometimes people may be touched by a mural, by an image in a way they wouldn't be by words. And so the middle image is actually of one of our Black elders with vote across his forehead. But this was actually part of a series that we did of Black families who wrote on themselves why they voted and what it meant for them to vote and who else they wanted to vote for. And the last thing we did was actually hold our candidates accountable. And so we hosted town halls of people who were running for office, and again, school board, sheriff, city council. But then we actually got questions from Black community, because sometimes we were intimidated to ask candidates questions. And so we said, that's okay, send us whatever questions you have and we will send them to the candidates. We can't tell you how to vote, but we will show you their answers. So if you think there should be a Black and African American Cultural Resource Center, we asked every candidate and here's what the candidate said. If you think that there should be independent oversight of the police department, we asked every candidate and here's what they said. Because we understand in community organizing, it is not just, showing up and protesting in the streets, it's actually engaging in critical consciousness raising, right? So it has to be providing information, which again, social workers are wonderful at doing, so that people can make the best decisions. And while we may not always agree, which happened a lot in our Black community meetings, we would require of ourselves to hold each other with love and to always agree to say, I just want to make sure that you have this opportunity. And then I'm going to my last slide, which should be a picture of direct action. So as you can see here, this is one of the protests that we organized in Santa Barbara. I'm that person with the megaphone. You can see behind me, there's a line of police with guards and shields. There also were a few armored vehicles behind me, because I felt like, for honest, it was hard to look at this photo for a bit of time because it was scary, right? But the honest truth is that voting is just one of many strategies. And if you are a person of a marginalized identity, you know that you have to use every strategy available to you, because you also know that there are some people who still don't have access to those rights, right? So for me in particular, with my identity as a Black person, right, it is important that I show up to vote personally for Black folks who may be undocumented, right? For Black folks who may have specific types of disabilities where they are not able to vote in the way that they wish, right? These are all the reasons why I show up, but I also understand that voting alone is not enough. We have to make sure we're showing up in our communities and speaking and providing opportunities for other people, but it's also not enough for us just to be creating a ruckus, right? We have to make sure that we're actually creating whole communities for people to ask questions, for people to show up, and for people to raise their consciousness. And with that, I will pass it to the next speaker.
Thank you, Simone. So I'm Sabrina Tayus, and what I'm going to tell you about is how I got involved in doing voter registration in the community. So, quick story. I've always been involved in politics in some way, but usually just as a voter. I would always vote on election day. But in 2008, Hillary Clinton ran for president, and I wanted to make sure she got elected. And so I joined different community organizations, and what they were doing is they were doing voter registration in communities near where I live. And I'd go out with them every weekend and we'd register voters. And when she dropped out, she said to help Barack. And so I continued on through 2008 to help Barack get elected. Then in 2016, when she ran again, I was back on board trying to help Hillary get elected. But this time, the focus was not on voter registration, it was on phone banking. And I'm not good at phone banking. Phone banking is where you call up registered voters and try to convince them to go out and vote on election day and to vote for your preferred candidate. I'm just not good at it. When you've seen someone who's good at phone banking, you know it. To me, it's anxiety producing. It makes me nervous to try to convince someone to do something. And so I wasn't good at it. So what I decided to do was to see if I could do voter registration. So what I did is I contacted my local board of elections and asked them, how do I get permission and training to register voters? And the lady on the phone said, I can train you right now over the phone in 5 minutes. I said, okay. And so for the next 3 minutes, she trained me. She told me you have to be 18 to vote. They have to fill out the form, be sure they sign it and all of that. After 3 minutes, she told me, come in tomorrow and pick up 20 of the voter forms that people have to fill out. I said, okay. So the next morning, I showed up to pick up the 20 forms. But by then, I had more questions. I said, what if a person asks me this? What if they're that? What do I do? And she answered my questions, and then she shushed me away. She said, you're ready, go and register people to vote. I said, okay. So I decided, first of all, I didn't feel like I was training. And to let you know, I eventually got training through the League of Women Voters. But right after that, I went and decided that if I was going to register people to vote for the first time, I needed to do it somewhere where if I screwed it up, I wouldn't be judged too harshly. So what I did is I contacted my local laundromat and asked the manager there if I could register voters on that coming Saturday from 10 to 2. And she said, sure. She said, I'll even tell you where to set up your table and chair. She showed me to put my table and chair by the sidewalk so I could get people passing by and I could get people going into the laundromat to do their laundry. I said, okay. So I got in my car and said to myself, you don't have a table or a chair. So I went to Target and bought one of those white folding tables. I went to Bed Bath & Beyond and bought a folding chair, the kind you sit at a wedding. And then I decided if I'm just sitting at that table with my table and chair and my forms and my pens, no one's going to know what I'm doing. So I needed a sign. So I went to Google and I found a sign that said register to vote here. I took that to Kinko's and they made me 2 large signs. So on Saturday morning, I showed up and I duct taped the sign to 2 parts of my table. One side of the table so you could see if you were coming down the sidewalk. The other side for the people who were at the laundry, they could see the sign, what I'm doing at that table, register to vote here. And so from 10 to 2, I registered 2 people to vote. But a bunch of people asked me questions that I couldn't answer because I'd only had 3 minutes of training. So on Monday, when I turned those forms in, I asked the lady the questions that the persons had asked me. She answered them. I called them up. I told them the answers. And then I decided I needed to try this again. So I had a friend who had a swap meet. A swap meet is like a flea market or a large garage sale where you sell your grandmother's stuff, right? And so I rented a table from him for $25, and it was on a Sunday. From 10 to 3, I registered 23 people to vote on my second time out. And after that, I had my confidence and I was off to the races. And so since then, we've registered people at local universities, all the community colleges here in St. Louis, in front of coffee houses like Starbucks. We've hit the festivals. We've gone to back to school events. And basically what I do is to find a location to register people. I usually find them on Facebook, believe it or not. And like they'll say they're having a festival or some event, and I'll find the contact number, send that person an email, ask could I have free table space? Sorry. Ask can I have free table space? And if not free, usually they'll give it to me for free, but if not, I'll ask can I have a reduced rate? And if not that, then I'll just pay. But usually, if I ask for free, I get free, except for the big events. In the last 2 years, though, I've been lucky. I had a grant where I could pay for vendor fees, booth space. And so I've been able to pay for that on my own. Often, as I'm registering people to vote at my little table, and you'll see my setup in a bit, as I'm registering people, usually women who are about my age or a little younger will come up to my table and say, how do I do what you're doing? How do I get this training? And usually I'll tell them the process I went through, and I said, I'll train you. So since 2016, I've probably trained 300 people here in St. Louis to register people to vote. And I have a team of volunteers. There are about 62 of us who will volunteer with me. And since 2016, we've registered or updated voter status for over 7,000 people in the St. Louis area. In 2018, after reading Mimi's article and that Voting is Social Work article, I decided to bring voter registration into the classroom. I teach 2 classes. I teach social welfare policy and I teach the HIPSI course. And so what I did is I brought the assignment, the students in my class have to complete assignments on voter registration. They have to either register to vote or prove that they're voting, they're a registered voter, by showing me a screenshot of their voter status. And they have to actually vote in the election. And since 2018, I'll bet my students went from maybe 10, 15% of them being registered to vote to now 90 to 95% of my students are registered to vote. On election day, maybe about 80 to 85% of them will vote, especially in the big elections. This year, though, I had a horrible realization that we had an election. This is off turn. And so we had an election recently where it was nothing unique about it. We weren't in one of the school districts where they're banning books. And the voter registration in this off-year election has dropped down to about 10%. And so I know now in off years, I'm going to have them maybe write an essay on why it's important to vote in off years, not just for president. So I'm going to have to do something to get the numbers up in off years. But I'm working at it. One of the voter registration drives I'm doing this week with a couple of volunteers, we're actually going to be at Washington University Law School event where we're going to use that QR code for the first time for social work, because I usually prefer to register people on paper, but the Board of Election prefers the online because all the information is correct. They don't have to worry about understanding someone's penmanship. So I'll use the QR code for the first time. So I want to show you a couple of pictures of me and my volunteers in action. So first slide. So this is us, believe it or not, this is me at a voter registration. This is a car fair where they show those classic cars and stuff like that. So this is us and me with one of my volunteers. Go to the next one. This is me at Pride Fest. Pride Fest is like shooting ducks, fish in a barrel, because it is so easy to register voters at Pride Fest. We end up over the 2-day period with several hundred people registered to vote. And I usually team up with Head Count at Pride Fest because they have all these young volunteers. So they help me do voter registration. The group of people you see here, they're from a Jewish temple, CRC, who are very involved in voter registration. Those are the volunteers at that one. Next one, next slide. This is me at, I think this was at just a community fair. And I'm by myself at this one because it was a small event. I try to go to larger events where there are lots of people, and this one was going to be small, so I just came by myself. Next one. This is me at the Mr. Leather contest. This is a gay bar, and they have hundreds of people there, trying to win be the Mr. Gay Missouri, but this was the Mr. Leather contest. I've been at this one with volunteers for probably 3 years in a row. So I really love this one. Next slide. This is me just at another festival. I think this this was at a school or something, but that's the sign you see in the front, register to vote here. That's one of the first signs I made at my first voter registration day. And as you see, one of my regular volunteers is with me, and you see someone sitting in a chair filling out their forms. I usually have a lot of chairs, outdoor chairs around my booth, because I have found that sometimes people just need somewhere to sit in the shade, and we can get to talk about voting and stuff like that. So it's a real nice hangout place, and it's easy to find me. Next slide. This is showing you what you need to conduct the voter registration drive. Basically, you need training for your state. You need to know where your board of elections are, what the rules are for your state, and basically just get training. And it shows here also the things you need. What I have is a clipboard and forms and pens. You need to find somewhere to do a voter registration drive where there's a lot of foot traffic. I prefer areas where there's not only a lot of foot traffic, but the people are diverse, young, old, students. Like there's an area here in St. Louis called the Del Mar Loop, and there are restaurants and little shops and coffee shops. And Washington University has a dorm nearby. There's a grocery store. And so you get a lot of foot traffic coming across that sidewalk. And it's usually just a really good place to register voters. And so anybody can do it. Like I said, I've trained over 300 people since 2016, and we've registered over 7,000 people to vote. This year, I've already signed us up for all 3 Pride Fest events. We're going to have one in St. Louis, one in a park, and one in a local suburb. And I've signed up for other events, festivals, and you name it. So I've already signed up for maybe 5 events that cover May, June, July, and September. That's it for me. You have any questions?
Hello, my name is Sam Fletcher, and I am the Executive Director for the New York State chapter of NASW. And you can go ahead and switch the slide. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my history, and that will help explain like how we go about voting at our chapter. I was born and lived in Oklahoma for 30 years. And Oklahoma is a very conservative state. I always laugh on election night if you're watching CNN or MSNBC or one of those channels when they show the election map. As soon as the polls close in Oklahoma with like 3% of the vote in, they color it red. Like it's within minutes of the polls closing. They know there's no way that state's going blue in any election. And I grew up primarily in the 80s. And at that time, I didn't have access to information about voting or the political process. I remember that we had 2 newspapers delivered every day, and those were local newspapers, and we had access to local news stations. I never had cable television growing up, so I never had access to those 24 hours news channels to talk about elections and the political process. Once I became an adult, I did register to vote. And one of the things that I remember is how many people came up to me after I registered to vote and told me it was my job to vote how my husband or my father instructed me to vote. Now I'm Cherokee, and that's not really how things work in Native culture. So I can remember to most of those people, I would respond with, my husband will vote how I tell him to vote, because I wanted to demonstrate like how stupid that statement was. I wanted them to hear it, like how ridiculous that sounded. I think the first time I really got information around issues and the people on the ballot was for the 2000 election. It took me 8 years to get my bachelor's degree because I put myself through college. So I was a little bit older, and I was in school, and I started to get all this information, and it was really exciting. And we voted. And for those of you who remember the 2000 presidential election, it was there was some controversy around it. We didn't know who the president was for a while. I can tell you from my local stations and newspapers, the biggest article that they had was chicken fighting was on the ballot that year, and way more attention was given to chicken fighting than any of the political candidates. But I can remember having conversations with people, and when I would tell them that I voted for Gore, I just remember the ridicule. Like immediately, people would ridicule me, not people at the school that I went to, but like community members. And they would talk about like how horrible it was to vote that way. And then what I really noticed was how they were voting against their own interests. And I didn't understand that, because I would explain, like, here are the issues that I was looking at. You know, Al Gore was huge on the environment. The environment is huge for Native people. So I was talking about all these things, but that wasn't even part of the conversation. It was, it seemed to me that they were basing a lot of their vote off the Bible, which was also a little bit confusing to me as well. At the time, I didn't really understand how those things related to each other. So my husband and I moved to New York in 2004, and it's a different world in New York. Pretty much everyone I know in New York is somewhat politically engaged, even if that just means they vote. They're politically engaged. Now, most people I know are more politically engaged. They know all the issues, they know what's going on, they know their politicians, they contact their politicians. And I wanted to make sure, one thing that was important, my husband and I wanted our kids to be raised in a much different environment than we were raised in. So we talked about voting and the political process all the time. And we have a transracial family. So we're mainly Native and Black. And our kids always went with us to vote. I can remember my daughter in the 3rd or 4th grade, she was able to describe the Electoral College, which I thought was really impressive. And I would say we were pretty successful, because our kids are adults now and they're registered to vote. And they actually understand issues and they understand the importance of voting. Now, I came to social work in my late 30s. So I would say that social work didn't really impact my thinking around voting or being politically engaged. I'd say it was more that social work aligned very well with the values I already had and how I already lived my life. I always say I came to social work for the social justice ethical principle that we work to change our societies. Now, I came to NASW, New York State, in 2019, September of 2019. And of course, 2020 was a huge voting year. I'm sure everyone remembers that. And so I want to talk about the different ways at the chapter that we've engaged people and tried to get people to vote. When I came in 2019, we spent a little over a year, like really building our services and everything. But one of the first things we did, our first thing we changed was advocacy and then voting. Now, one of the main philosophies we have at the New York State chapter is that as the staff, our job is to build a stage and then invite our very talented members to step onto it and share their expertise with other people. We have a member that is very politically engaged and a huge advocate around voting rights. So we asked her to do a continuing education program with us in 2020 to talk about the history of voting and essentially what you learned today, like all the historical attempts to keep people from voting, as well as the importance of social workers engaging in voting. Now, the same member also did what we call a chapter chat with a student of hers. Chapter chats are just another form of education at our chapter, but the difference is they're free and open to all social workers. And we get people from all over the world. We just had a chapter chat last week, and we had around 300 people with like 8 countries and multiple states represented. So it's one of our best ways of educating people and getting the message out. And we still have we record all of these, so we still have that chapter chat available for our members and non-members to watch. We also created a web page. The web page was important. And when I talk about the web page, everything we put on the web page, we also did a social media campaign. So we would make, I don't do social media at our chapter, so I'll sound stupid talking about it, but they would make posts highlighting the different things on the web page. Some of my favorite things on the web page is that we put all the voting deadlines in New York State. That we would do the posts letting people know here are the deadlines. we educated everyone on early voting in New York. What's that look like? Because that's relatively new in our state. And then we also had information about voting by mail. We also have information if you want to be a poll worker and work the polls the day of the event. How do you do that? How do you get involved? And my favorite part of the webpage, which we're now updating for 2022, is information for people who have a felony. You know, are you able to vote now? People with disabilities, legally what has to be at the polls for you to have access, or how do you vote for mail? By mail, sorry about that. And then we also have a voting while trans, because a lot of our members are transgender or they're gender nonconforming, and maybe the name that they use doesn't match their ID, and they may be in the middle of transitioning. So we have a lot of information about what does that look like and how can you vote and make sure that you're not kept from voting. And then the last thing, or this isn't quite the last thing, the second to last thing I want to talk about is once we had rebuilt the chapter and had all of the ways members can engage with us and engage with our services, we started talking to schools of social work, which there are a lot in New York, well over 50, maybe over 60 schools of social work, and organizations. So we go in and do a presentation. We do this all the time. I just did one on Friday. And every time I do a presentation, I take people through our website. The first thing I talk about is advocacy, because it's one of the main things that we do, of course. And our primary advocacy page has a big button that says register to vote. So when I talk to students and social workers about voting and advocacy in general, I always talk about the fact that we're a voting bloc. So in New York, there are 61,000 licensed social workers, and I'm not licensed. So there's a lot of people like me that are MSW or PhD or DSW or BSW that are not licensed. We probably have several more thousand that aren't licensed. So I just frame it that as social workers, we vote. So here's how you register. And you can share this link with whoever you want. We want you to share it with your friends, your family, your clients. And the last thing I want to say is that we've talked about this today, about the importance of nonpartisan, of being nonpartisan when you are trying to get people to not only register, but then to actually vote. Now, I remember very clearly what it felt like when I was told to vote how my husband or my father instructed me. And I think it's very important that we don't tell people what party they register for, and we don't tell them how to vote. It's very appropriate for us to provide information so they can educate themselves on the issues and what the candidates stand for. But we cannot tell them how they should register or how they should submit their ballot. So that is all for me. Thank you so much.
All right, I think we have time. There's one question that came into folks, and if there's anybody in particular that would like to answer this question, you're welcome to. And then after a little bit of Q&A, we'll transition to President Joyner. So anybody that feels comfortable to speak to this. So the question is really pertaining to, you know, how enduring this fight is for voting rights, and how many different barriers folks have to overcome. And so the question is, again, from anyone that wants to chime in, do you have any advice or counsel about how folks can kind of maintain their investment, commitment, and momentum with this kind of work?
I can start. I think getting involved is one of the ways to do that. I know it sounds like you're asking, what do you do to make sure people get involved? But once you get involved and other people see you, they get involved. And you can see from all the stories that you heard today, I don't think anyone's moving away from their commitment to continue doing voting rights activism. So one of the reasons we focused on these stories today was just for that reason, to excite and inspire people to get involved in voter engagement, all the levels of activity. So Share your stories, get involved, share your stories, and join our Power of Three campaign. Register 3 people, get them to register 3 people, and so on. And even the experience of someone who's not an activist, but who registers and or votes for the first time, it changes them. People have told us how it changes them and they want to do more. So that's one way to do it.
Great. And then a follow-up question, and this might be for just related to the Voting is Social Work website. Will folks be able to access information on local voting information through the Voting is Social Work, or do folks have recommendations about the best place to go to get local voting information?
It's a very important question, and our colleague who's not on the call today, Tanya, has stressed that, as we heard from several of you, it was really great because we are not focusing so much on that. And this is so important today. So I don't know that we have a specific link because 50 states, there are, 1,300 counties in the United States. So it will just take that first step to say, voting initiatives in my zip code or my county. And it's the kind of thing that Question Now will ask. We'll go back to our website and our folks and maybe put something on that at least could be the kind of link. If you're interested in, your local, something at least that does it. Thank you for that question, because it's alerting us to starting from the bottom up. We're focusing so much on how to get people in this non-year 2022 election, but there will be many on those ballots. Thank you.
Harry, I think we may have something that gives the rules for the states.
States, right, but not local. Yes, but not local. So we'll do some looking, at least to be able to have somebody click on something that addresses that. We probably could find something. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we'll continue with this. Sorry for the interruption, but that's what happens sometimes. The Power of Three campaign. We must show up, we must stand up, and we must speak up for the right to vote. An excerpt from Langston Hughes is, "There is a dream in the land with its back against the wall. To save the dream for one, it must be saved for all. Our dream of freedom." Well, that dream of freedom is our right to cast one vote. And why are we calling on you, social workers? Is because you have the power to make that happen. We had some great speakers today that illustrated why they vote and how they use their power as social workers to get others to vote. I want you to sit back and think about, what plan of action are you going to take? Are you going to go to the Target and buy a table and sit it outside of key places where people are going to get them registered to vote? Are you going to think about your forefathers who actually fought for your right to vote? I know for me, in order to get my allowance during voter time, my father would give me a stack of numbers that I had to go, because he was the block captain, that I had to call and ask, are they going to go vote? There was no such thing as the internet. I literally had to dial the numbers and do that. But I learned that as a young child, that my father believed in voting. You see, he went off and fought in World War II, and he was in a separate troop, because at that time the military was not actual, it was segregated. But he went off for this country and fought so that people would have their freedoms. And the one thing that I learned from my fellows at Howard University is every one of their students that spoke about voting, it all started when they were young kids, looking at the voting record of their families. We even had a young lady who was an immigrant, and her father said, I came to this country as an immigrant so that you would have that right to stand up and show up and speak up through voting. And that's what's up against the wall. But I don't want to make it all you all to think that it's an impossible task. We heard Sam talk about the fact, being from Oklahoma, that they colored it red within 3 seconds of being announced. Let's see what we can change. That is what happens. You know, when I taught at Westchester University, I used to tell my students, I will never live to see an African American president of the United States. Well, lo and behold, in 2008, I was still living when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. And I also saw him re-elected. You know, the one thing in this country that so many people are fighting against, or people are saying in these negative cultural wars, is because they don't realize that the beauty of America is our democracy, is our right to vote. Think about it. We had the Supreme Court rule in 2015 that all states must honor the same sex marriages. That's what voting and that's what your voice does. Yes, it's like a duck walk. Change is like a duck walk, 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, 3 forward and 2 back. But just last week, we saw the first African American woman confirmed to sit on the highest bench of the United States. So I say to you, use your energy and your passion and try to figure out a way to get 3 people registered to vote. For me, it not only means talking with my colleagues, it means talking with my family, because there are some in your family that are not registered to vote, but also talking with my neighbors, bringing them in. Let's talk about the right to vote. And young people, last time voting, 20 million young people were registered to vote. So we can bring change, social workers. Use your persuasive communication. Use your skills that you learned in every one of your social work programs. Social work is voting. No, we don't tell people how to vote. We tell people exactly how their vote is impacting so that they can study the vote. And yes, as we heard Simone talk about, it is the sheriff in town that you're electing. It is your school board member that you are electing. I sit in Pennsylvania, and we have a person that's running for our Senate that just came into Pennsylvania with a boatload of money to run. And we have to change that because he's not a Pennsylvanian. So it is important for us to get our energy up. Social work was never meant to be an easy major, but it was definitely made to be a change agent. You see, I'm going to end letting you know that I am sitting here in NASW where Whitney Young was president of NASW. And Whitney Young advised President Johnson, President Kennedy, and President Nixon, and was crucial in getting up the policy so that the voting rights bill could be crafted. He fought for the right to vote, and he was a social worker. He was president of your professional association. If Whitney can do it, and other social work presidents can do it, and I can ask you to do it, then so can you. That is the power of 3. So I thank you for sticking with us. Sorry for the glitch. And let us hear your plans. Let us know your plans on how you're going to craft an idea to get people to vote and make sure that their vote is counted. Thank you so much.
All right. I'd like to thank all of our presenters today, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for the Power of 3 campaign, Mobilizing Social Work's Vision and Voice Through Voting. This concludes today's program. Have a great day, and you may now disconnect.